Deep dive. By now, you should have a working understanding of the concept of a discourse community, and you should have identified a DC you are interested in exploring. With that in mind, you can turn your attention to the question we are using to frame our expository overview. How does this discourse community use writing to communicate? You will use Swales to ground your work within the larger exploration of discourse communities, and you will conduct first-hand research on the written text of your community, and specifically on the literacy practices used by the group to communicate and to confer and confirm membership status. The specific elements defined by Swales let us know what we can look for as we explore the text and literacy practices of our discourse community. Categories 2 and 3 in Swales' definition state that discourse communities have mechanisms of intercommunication that members use to communicate. Swales explains that these mechanisms are participatory, which means members are participants in the communications instead of simply recipients. If you read an article online, you may be able to comment at the bottom, but the information posted is generally a one-way communication, so readers are not participants because commenting is not communication. Threads, on the other hand, can allow for communication. Swales offers tweets, emails, and blogs as digital examples of mechanisms that can provide intercommunication. When thinking of mechanisms, then, think of how locations support or block channels of communication and create means for group members to do the same. A listserv, for instance, may require memberships in a group to sign up and may allow individuals on the list to reply all freely. To reply all and have the post moderated and not to post to the list at all. These choices impact and define communities, and as members of a group, our ability to participate is determined by the literacy practices that we are allowed and disallowed. For instance, Twitter, Reddit, Snapchat, and Facebook have different theoretical and practical approaches to communication. So as a group, selecting a site and source to use impacts the communication and literacy practices of the group. Category 4 in Swales' definition also notes that discourse communities use one or more genres to communicate among members and to communicate their public goals. Think of genres as the category of text being submitted through the mechanism. Genres can range from formal newsletters, emailed through the mechanism of a professional listserv, to informal memes posted on Facebook. Additionally, in Category 5, Swales states that discourse communities have a specific lexis and a membership capable of using the jargon and genres to communicate. One way to identify these terms is to recognize what you don't understand as an outsider, or what you do understand as an insider, that you know outsiders wouldn't necessarily understand. Swales defines himself as a bird-watching Whovian, and notes that he is an active member in discourse communities related to both. If most people tried to participate in a forum full of bird terms and Doctor Who references, they would be lost. Elements in addition to Swales' 8 criteria can also be identified and discussed. Some discourse communities value humor, while others share an ominous tone. Some meet face to face, and others live solely in digital spaces. Some groups expect innate traits that require members to be born into the group. Some limit memberships purposefully. Some have relatively open memberships. Some require rites of passage. Some require regular participation to maintain membership. Some charge a fee to join, and others demonstrate none of these characteristics. As you explore discourse community with the goal of informing your peers, allow yourself to look beyond the limits of definitions to search for connections and practices. But remember that your intention is to answer the question of how the DC uses writing to communicate. Diving in. Ideally, you have identified a discourse community and you've identified the shared characteristics of the group and the requirements to join. Hopefully, you've also started the work of looking for literacy practices. While some standard practices influence all groups, an element of discourse communities is that they often have their own ways and means of communicating that create cohesion among members and define outsiders as such. When you look at communication and literacy practices, in addition to looking for standard elements related to location, genre, vocabulary, and rhetoric, also look for internal means and methods that may not be standard across similar groups. For instance, if a discourse community is tied to an occupation, they may have standard practices for the industry or discipline, but the local chapter is likely to have individualized elements and use specific terms and references that function as an internal allusion, inside references that members beyond a local chapter probably can't understand, and that identify and connect local members within a larger organization. Groups may also have different practices in different locations, work or social, or sites, Facebook or LinkedIn, or a professional listserv or email list. Each group may have internal subgroups with even more individualized practices, but those would be difficult for us to locate and explore, and that isn't the goal of our task at hand. As you start to explore the written communications of the community you have selected, look closely at text you can access from the group. Consider the following questions as you look for literacy practices that define and are defined by the group. How would you categorize the community connection? Residential, social, hobby, academic, professional, social justice? What digital or print resources did you locate? Where does the group's primary communication occur, and how is intercommunication facilitated? What genres can you identify in the communications you located? What examples of specific lessons have you identified in the written communication of the discourse community? What are the main intentions of the communication, and what is communicated? Who leads and how is authority established? Are visual and nonverbal communication techniques established? Which? Swale suggests that a university creates a constellation of discourse communities. Which other discourse communities are connected to your discourse community and how? Once you have gathered this information, think about what it could mean. Think about what it tells you about the group. Think about how it applies to other groups you're involved in or know about. Think about how discourse communities and literacy practices impact you and how you impact them. Narrowing in. Building on Sway's criteria and the content you've collected and considered, we can begin to see a frame through which to approach our assignment. We can use Swales to ground the project within the larger exploration of discourse communities while conducting primary research on the written text of your community. The specific elements defined by Swales let us know what we can look for as we explore those texts and the literacy practices of our discourse community. To move Swales' criteria from theory to method, we have adapted the 8 criteria Swales identifies into a grid of 12 interrelated questions. Exploring each of these brief questions will provide us with a better understanding of how your discourse community, which is necessary in order to answer the question of how they use writing to communicate. Ideas. What are the explicitly shared goals, values, or interests of the DC? You may not need to look further than the name of the club or the title of the forum for this information. Some discourse communities also provide a formal description of their shared goals and values in a mission statement or club constitution. What are the unspoken rules or expectations of the DC? Unspoken rules and expectations require observation. Every DC has assumptions, practices, customs, or expectations that its members take for granted. Something as simple as knowing when to participate in a joke or meme counts as an unspoken agreement among the members of a community. How are new ideas introduced into this DC, and how is new knowledge created? How a group generates and shares knowledge can be formal and informal. The Academy has formal, disciplinary expectations, but even social online communities share news articles or introduce topics that previously had not been discussed within the group. People. Who are the important people, prominent voices, or authority figures in this DC? How is their authority or expertise established in this community? A club may have officers or a founder, and a discussion forum may have administrators and members whose names you see often and take on roles of providing explanations or clarifications. There may be celebrities, public figures, prominent experts, or public intellectuals who are regularly mentioned and discussed. Who are they, and how did they become important figures in the DC? Why do people look to and listen to them? How is their authority or expertise established in this community? Who is allowed to speak and participate? And conversely, who is not allowed to speak or participate? It may be as simple as saying members can participate and non-members cannot, but in many discourse communities, new members are expected to refrain from full participation until they've been around for a while other discourse communities are very accepting of non-members and allow them to participate fully before they have formally joined. How does one become accepted as a member of this DC? Local discourse communities may have registration forms and dues to pay, but any discourse community will have practices that members participate in to be seen as active and contributing. For a focal discourse community, becoming accepted might be as simple as participating regularly in class discussions, or it may require more involved activity like the creation of podcasts or posting images. Methods. How do members communicate and participate, and which technologies do they employ and rely on? Swales discusses mechanisms of intercommunication and explains that these mechanisms are participatory. A local discourse community might have regular meetings where members communicate verbally and rely on texting and email only to coordinate those activities. A focal discourse community might only interact electronically and may even limit itself to a specific social media platform, like Twitter or Instagram. What genres do they use to communicate? And how has this DC shaped these genres? Whether it's a post on social media, meeting agendas, or peer-reviewed journal articles, every discourse community exhibits specific preferences, styles, or conventions. Often these develop from the specific needs of the discourse community, but they may be tied to industry standards or other outside requirements. What specialized language, jargon, or shorthand does the DC use? Swales states that discourse communities have a specific lexics and a membership capable of using the jargon and genres to communicate. Clear forms of specialized language to spot are acronyms and initialisms, and trending phrases such as corporate lingo. But DCs create and adapt language in many ways to communicate more efficiently, and they use everyday words in specific ways that only people within the DC understand. Time and place. Where, physical or digital, do members of the DC frequent or inhabit? If digital, think about specific sites on the internet or specific hashtags on Twitter or Instagram, not the internet or the social media platform itself. If physical, don't just identify a location, but also try to describe the features of that location that might explain why the DC chose it. For example, does the location have a stage or central area where important speakers are the center of attention? Does it have a circular seating arrangement so each speaker receives equal attention? Or is it near Denny's? When and how often do members of the DC interact? Some discourse communities require daily interaction in order for members to stay up to date. Others require less frequent interaction, but expect more substance or content from individual communications, as in the publishing of a peer-reviewed article. When are the events daily, weekly, monthly, annual, etc., that are important to the DC? For a local discourse community, there may be monthly or even weekly meetings that members attend, as well as conventions or career fairs that happen less frequently but that members attend. A focal discourse community may await the weekly release of a specific podcast, or may become particularly active during the airing of award shows like the Oscars. At this point in the research and writing process for Project 2, the concepts and definitions of and around DC should finally start to come together, and you should begin to see how they interact with your expository overview. Assignment 15.1 will ensure that you have selected a specific DC and have explored it enough to assemble and investigate the specific pieces of writing you will use to answer the question of how your discourse community uses writing to communicate. To answer the questions in 15.1, you will need to spend time exploring your DC closely, so give yourself time to search, read, and think before you answer.